Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots. The Liquor Show's Death Slice Heart Peasants, Vassals, Seeds. I'm a useful idiot. Today we're going to talk about Sweden. And, of course, I enjoy this. My grandmother was from Sweden. Her name was Ingeborg Nelson. She had 13 children. But enough about her. Let's move on to Sweden, yet another country that could have an economic collapse, along with other ones that people don't necessarily suspect. And I've done videos about Australia and the Netherlands also being on the watch list, and they're going to go through similar things that we see all over the world. And one of the reasons why Sweden is a good example of a collapse is because they already had a real estate bubble collapse in the 1990s, and the bank sector was nationalized, and a banking crisis, the whole thing. And yet here it is 20 years later, and they're back in the same conditions. So here's a model of a country that's going to be like everyone else, and they're going to somehow get through that one crisis only to have a worse one later. And that's what's happening in Sweden. Apparently they didn't learn their lesson, and the new laws and regulations didn't really help. So what we have is the IMF came out with a report, and they actually have what amounts to 140-year mortgages in Sweden. So you can imagine what kind of a housing bubble they could have if paying off the principal is that slow a process in Sweden. And so this report says they think there's a lot of risk in the Swedish economy and a lot of risk to the Eurozone. And that's another reason why I want to bring this topic up, rather obscure, about Sweden, is to show that we still have countries that haven't even gone through the collapse process. And they're going to continue to be sending shocks through the rest of these struggling countries. So just as we have most of the countries in the Eurozone struggling right now, a shock from Sweden certainly is going to help a lot of these other situations. So we have household debt at 1.7 times disposable income, or 173% debt to household debt. So a sudden drop in property prices could wreak havoc. And they're among the most indebted people in Europe. And one of the things I was surprised to find out, as a matter of fact, is another story that surfaced about Sweden recently, that in spite of the fact that they have a free education college system in Sweden, the students there are loaded with debt, an average of 26,000, or actually I think it's an average of 13,000. I think 26,000 is the average in the United States. And so there's another irony of this system they have in Sweden. Even with free schools, the students load up on debt for their living expenses and everything while they go in school. And another interesting thing that came out about the Swedish real estate sector, and a lot of this information comes from a blog called Mish's Economic Report, Mike Mish Shedlock, and wonderful stuff. And anyway, he has the only information I've really seen thus far, other than my own research on what is going on Sweden. So highly recommended. So as it turns out, Swedish law regarding apartment buildings and ownership creates a collective mortgage, and that's to say if somebody in the building is not fulfilling their part, or there's people who move out of apartments, then the rest of the people in the building have to assume the liabilities. So that can make this real estate problem in Sweden much, much worse. And as we know, they have one of the world's most expansive welfare systems and a huge public sector. So very top-heavy, and once again, this can be very precarious if we have another real estate bubble collapse, and another banking sector collapse, and sovereign debt collapse in Sweden. The unemployment rate there is 8%, and amongst immigrant communities it's 16%. And just like we see all over Europe, they have a 30% youth unemployment rate. In fact, the only reason probably why we're not hearing more squawking from the youth in Sweden is because of that expansive welfare system. But having said that, Also the irony that recently we had riots in Sweden. So things are bad in Europe when there's riots in Sweden. But as it turns out, the rioting in Sweden is mostly immigrant. They have been one of the primary Eurozone destinations for a lot of refugees, including ones from Syria. So 15% of their population now is immigrants. And so imagine we're going to see something similar we see all over the world, is a targeting of immigrants when there is economic frustration. And the immigrants in Sweden are only going to antagonize latent racism throughout Europe. And there's always going to be targets when there's economic frustration. But other things about Sweden, there's only 9 million people there, so it's once again it's a relatively small country considering they're the third largest country in Europe by size. Commodity-based economy, and 50% of everything they make is exported. So considering that we're seeing huge slowdowns in the U.S. and the Eurozone and Asia, their primary markets, then this could exacerbate their situation if there's continued economic slowdown there. And I had to laugh doing some research, finding out that one activist said that what's happening in Sweden is, quote, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Sweden is starting to look like the USA, unquote. So now we're like the United States is the poster boy for economic disparity and wealth disparity in society. So that's kind of a sad commentary. So I think that's all I want to say about Sweden. So just keep an eye on yet another country that could send shockwaves through the Eurozone. I don't know the extent of what kind of loans they have in their banking system and what kind of exposure they have, but it'll be interesting to see, along with all these other potential hotspots that are still having to deal with what the rest of the world is dealing with, seemingly a country at a time, Netherlands and Slovenia and Australia and everyone else coming up to bat. So, there you have it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too. Yeah, sure.